The wind was a thief, stealing the breath from Alara's lungs and the last of the warmth from her threadbare coat. It scoured the plains of Wyoming, a vast, unforgiving expanse of brown and gray under a lid of iron sky. Each gust felt personal, a deliberate shove against her small frame as she wrestled with the latch on the ranch house gate. This place, the Double Bar L, was her last resort, a name on a piece of paper clutched in her numb fingers, a final, desperate prayer against the encroaching destitution that had shadowed her since her father's passing. The man who owned it, Mr. Sterling, had hired her sight unseen, his only correspondence a curt, single-sentence telegram. Cook needed. Room and board. Arrive by month's end. Inside, the house was no less austere than the land it occupied. It was a place of function, not comfort, smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and a deep, abiding loneliness. Ethan Sterling was a man carved from the same harsh landscape. Tall and broad, with shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of the sky, he moved with a deliberate, silent economy. He had met her at the door with a nod, his eyes, the color of a winter storm, assessing her in a single, unreadable glance. He didn't ask about her journey, her past, or the grief that clung to her like a second skin. He simply showed her the kitchen, the small, clean room that would be hers, and stated the terms of her employment. 3 meals a day. The house kept. No questions. Her first days were a study in silence. The house was governed by the rhythm of his labor. He was gone before the sun bled color into the horizon and returned long after it had sunk, leaving the world to the stars and the keening wind. He would enter the kitchen, shed his heavy coat stiff with frost, and wash the grime from his hands at the basin, his movements slow and methodical. They ate at the small wooden table, the only sounds the scrape of cutlery on enamel plates and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. The silence was a presence of its own, a heavy blanket that she initially found suffocating. She poured all her fear and sorrow into her cooking, kneading bread as if working the knots from her own heart, simmering stews that filled the cold space with the ghosts of forgotten warmth. Her father had taught her that a good meal was a form of communion, a way to speak when words failed. Here it was the only language she had. Ethan Sterling ate whatever she placed before him without comment. He never offered praise, but he never left a scrap. She watched him from the corner of her eye, this solitary man who wrestled a living from an unyielding earth. She saw the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes, the network of scars on his hands that told stories of broken fences, stubborn livestock, and the brutal calculus of survival. He was not unkind, merely distant, a remote mountain peak she could see but not approach. He left her portion of wages in a small envelope on the mantelpiece every Saturday, a silent, respectful acknowledgement of their arrangement. One evening, a blizzard descended without warning, a swirling vortex of white that erased the world. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the window panes and forcing snow through the tiniest cracks in the walls. The temperature plummeted. Alara huddled by the fire, her anxiety a cold knot in her stomach. Ethan was still out, checking the herd. Hours passed, each one stretching into an eternity of fear. She kept a pot of stew hot on the stove, its savory steam a fragile defiance against the storm's fury. She paced the length of the kitchen, her gaze fixed on the door, praying to a God she wasn't sure she still believed in. When the door finally burst open, he stumbled in, a figure of ice and snow, his face raw and his breathing ragged. He leaned against the doorframe for a moment, the strength seeming to drain from his powerful frame. He had saved the new calves, moving them into the relative shelter of the barn, but the effort had cost him dearly. His gaze found hers across the room, and in that instant, the silence between them changed. It was no longer an absence of words, but a shared space, filled with her palpable relief and his silent, bone-deep weariness. He didn't speak, but his eyes held a flicker of something she had never seen before, a raw, unguarded vulnerability. Without a word, she ladled the hot stew into a bowl, her hands trembling slightly, and set it on the table. It was more than just food. It was an offering. an anchor in the storm. The blizzard raged for 3 days, trapping them in the small house. The enforced proximity shifted the foundations of their silent arrangement. He was no longer just the stoic rancher disappearing into the landscape. He was a man, mending a torn saddle by the fire, his large hands surprisingly deft with the needle and all. She was no longer just the cook, a shadow in the kitchen. She was a woman, reading a worn book of poetry her mother had loved, her brow furrowed in concentration. They began to speak, their words sparse and carefully chosen, like stones placed to cross a river. He asked about the book. She asked about a particular scar on his arm. He told her of a wild horse. She told him of her father's garden. Each small revelation was a thread, tentatively woven into the space between them. She learned his quiet ways. She saw that his stoicism was a shield, forged by loss she could only guess at. He had inherited the ranch after his family was taken by fever years ago, and he had worked it alone ever since, his only companions the cattle and the wind. She understood his fierce independence was a form of survival, a way to keep a heart from breaking a second time. In turn, he began to see her. He noticed the way she paused to watch the sunset, the faint dusting of flour that always seemed to be on her cheek, the quiet resilience that burned in her eyes. She was not fragile. She was a sapling that had learned to bend in the wind so as not to break. One afternoon, as the storm began to subside, she found him in the barn, his arm wrapped around the neck of a sick calf, whispering to it in a low, soothing voice. The tenderness in the gesture was so at odds with his rugged exterior that it made her chest ache. He looked up and saw her standing there, and for a moment, she thought he would retreat behind his usual wall of silence. Instead, a faint, sad smile touched his lips. "He's a fighter," he said, his voice raspy. She knelt beside him in the clean straw, placing a hand on the calf's trembling flank. "He has a good reason to be," she replied softly. They stayed there for a long time, their shoulders nearly touching, sharing the warmth of their bodies with the small, struggling creature. In the quiet solidarity of that moment, a fragile trust took root, as delicate and tenacious as the first green shoots of spring pushing through the frozen earth. The world outside was still cold and harsh, but within the walls of the barn, a different kind of warmth had begun to bloom. As the snow melted and the plains awoke in a blush of green, the tentative trust between them deepened into a quiet companionship. The rhythms of the ranch became their shared pulse. Alara found a surprising strength in herself, a resilience she never knew she possessed. She learned to mend fences, her hands growing calloused but capable. She helped Ethan birth a full one moonless night, her initial fear giving way to a profound sense of awe as the slick, long-legged creature took its first shuddering breath. He, in turn, began to inhabit the house in a way he never had before. He started taking his meals at the table even when she wasn't there, as if seeking the lingering warmth of her presence. He brought her a cluster of stubborn wildflowers he'd found growing in the shelter of a rock outcropping, leaving them in a glass jar on the windowsill without a word. The bright purple blossoms were a silent testament, a splash of color in their monochrome world. Their conversations grew, flowing more easily now, filling the spaces once occupied by silence. She spoke of her childhood in a small eastern town, of her father's quiet wisdom and her mother's love for music. He spoke of the land, not as a property to be owned, but as a living entity with moods and memories. He pointed out the hawk that nested in the old cottonwood, the subtle shift in the wind that heralded rain, the history etched into the face of the distant mountains. He was sharing his world with her, the one he had guarded so fiercely, and she felt the immense privilege of being allowed inside. She learned that his silence wasn't born of indifference, but of a profound watchfulness, a habit of listening to the world instead of speaking at it. But the world beyond the double bar L was not as peaceful. A man named Silas Croft, a land speculator with a reputation for greed and a smile that never reached his cold eyes, had been buying up smaller ranches in the county. He saw the plains not as a home, but as a commodity, a future for railroads and towns built on the bones of other men's dreams. Croft had his sights set on Ethan's land, its reliable creek a prize in the arid landscape. He began with offers delivered by smirking intermediaries. When Ethan refused, the offers turned to thinly veiled threats. Fences were cut in the night. A section of pasture was mysteriously set ablaze. A shadow of menace fell over the ranch, a constant low-grade tension that frayed the edges of their hard-won peace. Alara saw the worry settle deep into Ethan's bones. He grew more silent again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, fraught with anger and a grim determination. He spent longer hours riding the perimeter of his property, his rifle a familiar weight in its scabbard. Fear, a cold and familiar companion from her past, tried to reassert its grip on her heart. She could leave. Her contract was fulfilled. She had some money saved. She could find a safer place, a softer life. But the thought of leaving the ranch, of leaving him, felt like a betrayal, a tearing away of a part of herself that had only just begun to grow. This land was no longer just his. It was hers, too. She had invested her sweat, her hope, and her heart into its soil. The confrontation came on a blistering summer afternoon. Croft arrived himself, flanked by two hard-faced men. He found Ethan and Alara repairing a section of corral, the rhythmic strike of their hammers the only sound in the oppressive heat. Croft dismounted, his expensive boots stirring up clouds of dust. He ignored Alara completely, his focus entirely on Ethan. "Sterling," he began, his voice slick with false cordiality. "Still playing the homesteader? I'm making you my final offer. It's a generous one. More than this dust bowl is worth." Ethan didn't stop his work. He drove another nail home with a single, powerful blow before turning, his face an impassive mask. "This land isn't for sale, Croft. I've told you before." Croft's smile tightened. "Everything's for sale. It's just a matter of price. Or persuasion." He gestured to one of his men, who stepped forward and kicked over a bucket of nails, scattering them in the dirt. It was a petty, arrogant act of dominance. A challenge. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She saw the muscles in Ethan's jaw bunch, a dangerous stillness coming over him. She knew he could meet their violence with his own, but she also knew it would only escalate things, giving Croft the excuse he wanted. Before he could move, Alara stepped forward, placing herself slightly in front of him. She met Croft's dismissive gaze with a look of pure, cold steel. "You've heard him," she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying an authority that surprised them all, including herself. "This is his home. You are not welcome here. Please leave." Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "And who is this? The hired help? You have no say in this, girl." He took a step toward her, his eyes glinting with malice. "Maybe I should persuade you instead." In that instant, Ethan moved. He was not fast, but inevitable like a rockslide. He didn't raise his voice or draw a weapon. He simply placed his large frame between Alara and Croft, a silent, immovable wall. His presence was more intimidating than any threat. "You will not speak to her," he said, his voice a low, deadly rumble. "And you will get off my land." Now the air crackled with tension. For a long moment, the two men stared each other down. Croft, for all his bluster, was a predator who understood strength. He saw something in Ethan's eyes, a line that had been crossed, a protective instinct so primal and absolute that it was not worth testing. With a sneer, he motioned to his men. "This isn't over, Sterling." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and simmering hatred in his wake. The aftermath of the confrontation settled around them, a heavy, charged silence. The immediate threat was gone, but the larger danger remained, looming over them like a thunderhead. Alara's heart was still pounding, a frantic drum against her ribs. She looked at Ethan, who was staring after Croft's retreating form, his body still rigid with a tightly controlled fury. She had been terrified, but she hadn't run. She had stood her ground, for him, for the home they had inadvertently built together. He finally turned to face her, his storm-colored eyes searching her face. The hardness in them softened, replaced by an emotion she couldn't quite name. A complex mixture of gratitude, concern, and something deeper, more profound. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice rough. "He's a dangerous man." She simply shook her head, unable to articulate the fierce loyalty that had compelled her to act. "This is my home, too," she whispered, the words feeling more true than anything she had ever said. The admission hung in the air between them, simple and momentous. He reached out, his calloused hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before it gently cupped her cheek. His touch was not possessive, but reverent, as if he were holding something precious and breakable. The rough texture of his skin against hers sent a tremor through her, a current of warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw the walls around his heart crumble, revealing the lonely, steadfast man within. That evening, a sense of quiet resolution filled the small house. They moved around the kitchen preparing the evening meal together, their movements synchronized in a familiar, comfortable dance. The unspoken had finally been brought into the light. They had faced a threat not as employer and employee, but as partners. They had protected each other. After they ate, they sat on the porch steps, watching as the sky caught fire with the setting sun, painting the vast landscape in hues of orange and violet. The beauty of it was fierce and poignant. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The shared silence was now a comfortable embrace, a testament to all they had overcome. Ethan finally turned to her, his profile outlined against the fading light. His expression was serious, his gaze direct. "Elara," he began, his voice low and imbued with a sincerity that resonated deep within her soul. "When I hired you, I just needed someone to cook the meals, to keep the house from falling into dust." He paused, searching for the right words, a rare and touching vulnerability in his struggle. He looked down at his own scarred hands, then back at her. "But the meals you make, they aren't just food. You put the warmth back in this house. You put the life back in it." He took a steadying breath, his eyes holding hers. "For years, I just needed to be fed. I ate the food. Now I crave the cook." The words were simple, yet they held the weight of a lifetime of solitude. He wasn't speaking of hunger for her cooking, but of a deeper, more essential need. A need for her spirit, her strength, her presence. A craving for the hope she had brought into his desolate world. A tear she didn't know she'd been holding slipped down Elara's cheek. It was a tear not of sorrow, but of profound, overwhelming relief. It was the release of a past filled with loss and the embrace of a future she had never dared to imagine. She had come to this place seeking shelter and had found a home. She had sought a job and had found a purpose. She had faced a hard and solitary man and had found the steadfast heart of a partner. She didn't need to answer with words. She simply reached out, her hand finding his, and intertwined their fingers. It was a silent promise, a quiet acceptance. Together, they watched the last of the light fade, leaving the plains to the vast, star-dusted canopy of night. No longer two lonely souls, but a single, resilient constellation in the darkness.